The comedian Groucho Marx once said, "Money frees you from doing things you dislike. Since I dislike doing nearly everything, money is pretty handy." Sounds good in theory, and I get his point, but how can we actually live off our money and avoid doing things we dislike? Well, it's called the 4% rule. Maybe you've heard of the 4% rule before, but in today's video, we're gonna cover some aspects of it you may not know about and discuss why the 4% rule isn't good for everyone. There was also a recent Wall Street Journal headline that caught my attention. In it, they talk about a new report from the research group Morningstar that just came out on how the 4% rule holds up in today's challenging economic environment. And we're gonna get more into that too. As we'll discuss, the way the 4% rule is calculated doesn't factor for what's been happening lately as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, such as global supply chain issues and a pending recession. To be honest, everything feels completely unpredictable right now. The markets are up one day, then they're down the next. Investors on Wall Street look like they're in acting school. The report from Morningstar does shed some light though for us, so stay tuned. Hey everyone, I'm Neil from Roundup Save, and if you're new here, we learn to demystify money so we can build wealth that lasts. The 4% rule, also known as the 25X rule, is a general estimate for how much of our savings we can safely withdraw and use as income when we retire, to pay for anything we really can afford, from living expenses to travel. So we typically think of retirement as being around the age of 65 years old, which is when retirees traditionally might stop working completely. But that's not always true, especially if you achieve financial independence and you decide to retire earlier than 65 years old. Some people I know decided to retire in their 30s and their 40s, and they did this through maintaining a high savings rate, somewhere in the ballpark of 50 to 75% of their income, much of which they ended up investing for the long term. Either way, the 4% rule would roughly apply in both cases. So the 4% rule isn't the Bible, and we can't just take it at face value. As we're gonna cover in the rest of today's video, a withdrawal rate of 3% or maybe even 7% might be better depending on your finances. Take Him from Financial Tortoise has a good analogy for the 4% rule, which is, it's kind of like using Google Maps to see how long a drive might take. It's really a general estimate and should be thought of as a guideline, but the reality is there's traffic, construction, bad weather, or an accident on the road that could delay you. Okay, so here's an example of the 4% rule in action to help keep us grounded. Let's say you break out Roundup Save's budget model in Google Sheets, I'll link the video down below, and you calculate your living expenses for 1 year. Let's say it's $40,000. Using the 4% rule, you can calculate how much money you would theoretically need to retire. Remember when I said the 4% rule is also known as the 25X rule? Well, that's because 100% of your retirement portfolio divided by the percent you expect to withdraw each year, in this case 4%, equals 25. So using this, we can calculate roughly how much money we might need to retire. So going back to our example earlier, $40,000 in annual expenses times 25 equals $1 million. So let's talk about why it's 4% exactly, why the rule makes sense if you retire at age 35 or 65, and if it accounts for inflation. We know that pretty much everything is going to get more expensive over time. A gallon of milk used to cost $2.50 back in 1995, but today it costs almost double that at $4.20. So how does this possibly work if our cost of living is only going to continue to increase over time, but our savings doesn't? So in 1998, researchers from Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas, ran different simulations to see how long an investment portfolio might last based on how the US stock market has performed between 1926 and 1997. This became known famously as the Trinity study. So the researchers looked at different variables in creating some of these simulation portfolios. First, they looked at asset allocation, meaning the percent of stocks versus the percent of bonds, which is generally a good measure of risk to reward in a portfolio. And secondly, they looked at withdrawal rate, meaning how much money is taken out of an investment portfolio each year to live on. They also repeated the study in 2009 and included stock market data between 1997 and 2009 in the process, accounting for the 2008 recession. So when they first ran the study, the average retiree in the US was retiring around age 65. So the researchers assumed that the average retirement portfolio would need to last about 30 years based on life expectancy. And so that's what they used to do their calculations. But honestly, that's not really helpful if we want to retire earlier than 65 years old, right? You might need that money to last for 60 years or more. We'll come back to this point. Okay, so here were the results. The studies showed that there was at least a 98% success rate of a given portfolio lasting 30 years at a withdrawal rate of 4% in the first year, and then 4% plus inflation, so closer to about 6% each year after. In terms of asset allocation, the portfolios had to be made up of 100% stocks, meaning more growth, but also more volatility, or 75% stocks and 25% bonds, meaning slightly less growth and slightly less volatility to be most successful. The calculations also did factor in the impact of inflation. By the way, the stocks here we're talking about are mostly low-cost index funds. We're not talking about having all your money in GameStop. So if this all sounds a little bit confusing, not to worry, it definitely tripped me up when I first learned about it as well. Things started though to really click when I really went a little bit deeper into the Trinity study, and I started asking questions and reading other analyses. I'll link 2 independent analyses down below in the description, one from the Poor Swiss and the other from Game of Budgets. Both of these are online personal finance blogs. So this chart from the study shows the success rates when looking across different withdrawal rates and asset allocations. As you can see here, these were the portfolios that were most successful. Anything higher than a 4% withdrawal rate over the same 30 years meant a lower success rate. And I want to be clear about something. A lower success rate than 100 isn't necessarily a bad thing. You might choose to have a withdrawal rate of maybe 7%, but you have the flexibility to earn extra income if needed. And if that's the case, that's totally fine. 4% isn't a hard rule, and especially it's not a hard rule if you don't want it to be. The study did show though that lowering the withdrawal rate to 3% had the best chance of success across all the asset allocations being tested. But that would actually mean that you'd have to live off a smaller amount of money, especially earlier in your retirement. So if you wanted to calculate how much you'd need to retire, instead of multiplying your current expenses by 25, like we talked about before, you'd actually multiply it by 33. This would mean that you need more money for retirement if you want to, basically maintain your current standard of living. Alternatively though, you could just do the opposite and cut back on your expenses if that's an option for you. Also, because the portfolios are invested for a long period of time and see compounding gains, your entire portfolio is continuing to grow. And this is actually a really important point. This means that while the withdrawal rate would need to stay around 3 to 4% per year to be successful most of the time, you would actually still have money left over in your portfolio after the 30-year period. And this is pretty cool stuff, and it helps explain why you can retire earlier than 65 years old and still be just fine. Here's another chart from the study that shows this. The chart assumes you start with $1,000 in your portfolio, or $1,000 principal, at a 4% withdrawal rate and an asset allocation of 100% in stocks. For example, you'd have a median amount of $10,075 left over after 30 years. In other words, if you started with $1 million as your initial portfolio amount when you retire, you'd on average have over $10 million left over after 30 years when still factoring in for your living expenses. And that's because we're talking about percentages. And if you take 4% each year from a portfolio that's growing at the same time in theory, the actual amount you'd be able to withdraw each year increases. It's really a win-win-win. We don't have to do things we dislike, you get more money to spend, and you're still building wealth. All right, so this is all great, but does the 4% actually still hold true today? Yes, kind of. And there's a couple of criteria to be aware of. So as long as you're willing to stay a little bit closer to that 3% than 4%, you're open to adjusting some of your asset allocation, and you're careful about keeping your withdrawal rate in check despite growing inflation, meaning try not to ramp it all the way up to 7% if you can help it, you should be all right. And here's why. The average return of the stock market is about 10% per year over the last century. And while it's true that the first 10 years of the stock market returns after you retire are important, the stock market has always recovered and kept growing over a long time horizon. Of course, using historical data to do future projections won't always be accurate. It's directional at best, and at worst, it could be completely wrong. The good news is there's 100 years of data here, and that includes significant events like a depression, a world war, multiple recessions, and bubbles. As far as the Morningstar report goes, their findings show that a 3.8% withdrawal rate is most reliable for retirees with portfolios between 30% to 60% asset allocation in stocks and the remaining percent in bonds. Less than 30% in stocks lowers the success rate of having enough money left over after 30 years after adjusting for inflation. On the other side, having more than 60% in stocks could mean a lot of volatility in the short term as we potentially enter a recession and see portfolio losses. And that basically means taking out money from a portfolio that's shrinking. So I'll link both the Wall Street Journal article and the full Morningstar report in the description below. Okay, so here are some general retirement strategies we can use based on the 4% rule. Number one, don't be opposed to working again, even just part-time, if you're retired. One of the benefits of retiring early before 65 years old is, if needed, you can always jump back into the workforce, or you can find side hustles if the economy slows down. That's also gonna really help you stay closer to that 3% withdrawal amount, or even less. Number two, be flexible on your spending and stay disciplined. If the economy isn't doing well, like right now, and inflation is high, you should try to be in a position where you don't have to increase your withdrawal rate to 6% or more to adjust for inflation. Being able to do things like dining out less and cooking at home more, or avoiding big expenses during this period are good options, because then you're not spending a bigger percentage of your retirement when it is actually costing you more and your portfolio may be shrinking. Number three, keep your emergency fund on the side always. This one is definitely debatable, but when it comes to withdrawing money from your retirement, always anticipate for a rainy day. Like, for example, a health emergency or home or car repairs. These are things we just can't predict, right? By keeping an emergency fund on the side, you don't need to pull more money out of your retirement than what's absolutely necessary. Remember, your money that's invested is still growing, so don't disrupt it if you can help it. All right, guys, that's it. Thanks so much for sticking around till the end of the video. Let me know if you have any thoughts or questions in the comments below. Please subscribe to Roundup Save for more content just like this, and give this video a thumbs up if you found it helpful. Keep on thinking long term, and till next time, take care.